Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, after the U.S. election, back to reality.
Every time a group of people start chanting the riot police, move in.
The state of the media worldwide.
Who are you? You bloody idiots.
The not so good, the bad, and the ugly sides of press freedom around the globe.
We just managed to slip away from our minders very briefly.
We have a special report on the Index on Press Freedom. Welcome back. Once a year, the media freedom group Reporters Without Borders publishes its Index on Press Freedom, ranking every country in the world according to its record on freedom of expression. This year's index tells a story of repression because of war, dictatorship, and the failure of democracy. In this edition of The Listening Post, we'll be looking at some of the places which have the dubious distinction of being at the bottom of the index. We'll hear how some of the richest countries on earth are slipping down the list, and we'll be taking a reporter's eye view of the media in some of the most repressive countries in the world, from Belarus to North Korea. But first, our starting point, a user's guide to the Index on Press Freedom. Here's The Listening Post's Salah Khadr.
War. The single biggest threat to press freedoms worldwide. Not dictatorship, not poverty, not corruption, nor oppressive regimes.
Who are you? You bloody idiots.
That's according to the annual World Press Freedom Index 2008.
Every year, Paris-based Reporters Without Borders asks a series of questions about the treatment of journalists, freedom of speech and information, and media ownership in 173 countries worldwide. The index doesn't make happy reading for many governments or for the millions of people who depend on that very media every day.
At the bottom of the list is what the index calls the infernal trio: Eritrea, Turkmenistan, and North Korea. All nations described by the index as open prisons, whose populations are cut off from the world and subjected to media propaganda of a bygone age. Dictatorship, sometimes disguised, sometimes not, is a common thread running through the worst countries on the list. Sitting at 170 on the index is Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, and its ruling military of General Than Shwe have for years viewed local and foreign media as threats to the regime. Journalists in Myanmar have often paid the price of self-expression with their freedom. This year's Olympic host China threw a great party, but they're still 7th from the bottom at number 167 on the list. Despite allowing foreign media greater access during the Games, this year saw the imprisonment of yet more journalists and dissidents. Most notably, Hu Jia, the recipient of this year's European Union Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, who was jailed in December 2007 for posting articles online and giving interviews to foreign journalists. Places where leaders' most banal activities dominate state TV news and their portraits decorate the streets share a category in the index called unchanging hells. Muammar Gaddafi's Libya at 160 and Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus at 154, both countries where the media is built around the cult of a personality, come in for special attention for their stale and repressive attitudes to press freedom, despite recent public declarations of reform. Russia, which often boasts about its new democratic credentials, sticks at 141st in the index. The trial of those accused of murdering investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya started last week amid accusations that her lawyer had been deliberately poisoned to keep her away. At 151st is Zimbabwe and the media oppressive regime of Robert Mugabe. It's too soon to say if the inclusion of Morgan Tsvangirai's party in the government will change the country's ranking, or open it up to foreign news organisations like the BBC, who are currently banned. Two countries that have shown no improvement in this year's rankings are Egypt and Iran. Both are notorious for curtailing new media and their respective blogospheres in particular. A case in point, the ongoing saga over the imprisonment of Egyptian blogger Karim Amir. Countries that have become embroiled in violent conflicts or political chaos such as Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan and Somalia continue to be highly dangerous black zones for the press. Places where journalists are targets for murder, kidnapping, arbitrary arrest or death threats every day. They may come under fire from the parties at war, they may even be accused of taking sides, such as the case in the Palestinian territories at 163rd, especially the Gaza Strip, where the situation has deteriorated after Hamas seized power. Israel, whose domestic press freedoms earn it 46th place, only ranks 149th for its activities outside its own territory, including the killing of Palestinian journalists by their armed forces. But Reporters Without Borders reserve their main criticism for the economically most powerful democracies in the world. They say they are exploiting the international community's divisions and the ravages of the wars carried out in the name of the fight against terrorism. This puts the United States at 36th domestically, but at 119th outside its own territory. Al Jazeera cameraman Sami al-Hajj's release after 6 years in Guantanamo Bay serve as reminders that wars sweep away not only lives, but also, and above all, freedom.
Over the past year, our reporter Simon Ostrovsky has been to some of the worst offenders on the list for the Listening Post. Russia, number 141, where he reported on the presidential elections in March. Belarus, number 154, the former Soviet state known by the U.S. as Europe's last dictatorship. And Myanmar, number 170, where he investigated the difficulties of reporting on the aftermath of Cyclone Nargis last May. Foreign reporters are seldom well received by the authorities in those countries. The governments there would prefer the media to tell the story their way or not at all, especially during times of crisis or elections. And our reporter was no exception. The Listening Post's Simon Ostrovsky now on his experiences in some of the worst countries for the news media in the world.
In some countries, asking questions is the last thing you want to do. But it's hard not to when your job is to be a reporter. The Press Freedom Index ranks countries for their performance on protecting free speech. But what does it mean to actually be a journalist in one of the places close to the bottom of the list?
Over the last year, I've visited some of the worst offenders, and what I've found is that over there, journalism is a profession that should come with a health warning.
I traveled to Russia, Myanmar, and Belarus. What do all three countries share? They've got leaders whose power is uncontested and they don't tolerate criticism. For journalists, that means they're routinely muzzled, beaten, and imprisoned. Sometimes their job costs them their life. In Russia, I came ahead of a national election. That meant journalists were under even more pressure than usual. There were no surprises as far as the outcome of the vote. As predicted, former President Vladimir Putin's anointed successor, Dmitry Medvedev, easily won an election in which the Russian media fell in line behind the Kremlin.
In fact, state-run TV then made sure that Medvedev was the only star of the show, and then the opposition says they went even further than that. They essentially extorted people to go to the ballot boxes yesterday.
Since Putin's rise to power, the state has extended its control over the airwaves, and once independent broadcasters have been nationalized. As a result, the opposition wasn't getting any airtime.
Mr. Kasparov, do you think your words said here today will be on Russian television tonight?
Everybody knows the answer. Of course not.
Why not?
But you should ask people who control Russian television. They are not hiding the fact that there are so-called blacklists and or stop lists, and they know that if we are given a chance to promote our views, things could be very different.
Thank you.
But for those of us trying to cover opposition rallies, the lack of coverage of critics on state TV was the least of our worries. We just wanted to get the pictures without getting clubbed by the riot police.
Every time a group of people start chanting the riot police, move in.
Russia has seen a string of killings of media personnel, and Anna Politkovskaya was only the latest and most prominent of the victims. Like so many before her, her case remains unsolved. My next stop was Myanmar. It's fourth from last on the Press Freedom Index, sandwiched between such bastions of free thought as Turkmenistan and Cuba. Its military regime won't even allow journalists into the country, so I had to pretend to be a tourist to get a visa. But that wasn't the end of my troubles. I'd come to report on the after effects of Cyclone Nargis, a natural disaster that claimed over 130,000 lives. But the government was so intent on keeping a lid on the rescue efforts that they'd cordoned off the disaster zone to all foreign observers. But more critically, aid workers were being barred too. I tried in vain to get out of the main city, Yangon.
No comment. No comment.
Why?
Government. No.
Then a roadblock.
No entry without permission.
No entry without permission?
Yes.
How do I get permission?
Oh, you got the Ministry of Defense. Army.
Ministry of Defense?
Armies, yes.
To find out about the cyclone victims, I had to do what ordinary people in Myanmar do when they want the news: buy illegal DVDs off the street.
Do you like some tea or coffee? How are you?
Hi.
One day here in the outside the Yangon.
Yes.
It's nearly the water pagoda. People also died.
Yes.
People also very hungry.
How much for 3 times?
3 for you take only 80.
The discs showed the chaos the government didn't want anyone to see. But my problems were nothing by comparison to a blogger who recently received a hefty prison sentence simply for putting up critical posts on his webpage. Nepon Lat is to spend the next 2 decades behind bars. His incarceration is a stark warning to anyone in Myanmar who wishes to use anything but official sources of information. Belarus is a Soviet-era throwback in the heart of Europe. It's been ruled by the same man ever since it became independent 17 years ago. I found out what it was like to be a local journalist covering the politics of his regime. Alexander Liankevich is a freelance photographer who got more than he bargained for when covering an opposition protest last winter.
I got, I think, 3 kicks in my nose and my head, and they crashed my light. It's very difficult to describe, you know, when you're pressed between like 50, maybe 60 really huge guys in black. And when you, because, you know, all the time I was trying to say, I'm a journalist, call to your, I know the names of the, you know, officers, the most important officers. I was trying to call them, like, they were just laughing and kicking me, so it was like, you know, shocking situation.
Covering official events in Belarus has its drawbacks too. I was invited to a press conference where President Alexander Lukashenko was meeting his counterpart from Russia, the newly elected Dmitry Medvedev. Lukashenko's press secretary, Pavel Lyohki, was very helpful when it came to chaperoning journalists around. He even carried my cameraman's tripod. But when the press conference started, it was like no other I'd ever attended, because apparently questioning the leaders isn't part of the local custom.
Павел Николаевич, даже ни одного коротенького вопроса задать нельзя будет.
Про здоровье. Как ваше самочувствие? Коллеги, ну мы договорились.
Так.
Давайте мы будем сотрудничать конструктивно. Ни одного вопроса.
Понятно.
In Belarus, as in so many of the places I've visited this year, they talk. You're expected to just listen.
After the break, North Korea, reporting from the world's most repressive dictatorship.